I've been reflecting this week on the cascade of events since the turn of the year. And just trying to list them makes my head swim. Maybe it's just me, but it seems as if it's been an intense period of time. On January 8th, for instance, the Representative Gabriel Giffords was shot outside a Safeway grocery store in Casa Adobes, Arizona. During her first Congress at Your Corner gathering of the year, a man ran up from the crowd, started firing, hit 19 people, killed 6. That was January 8th. And then starting on December 17th, a series of events which started with Mohamed Bouazizi, Tunisian street vendor who set himself on fire in protest of the confiscation of his wares. One report is that he refused to pay a bribe, had his little pedal cart seized, and out of his humiliation and anger, set himself on fire, and that this act of desperation became the catalyst as we turned into 2011 for the Tunisian revolution, sparking deadly demonstrations, riots throughout Tunisia in protest of social political events in the country. Anger and violence intensified, leading to then President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to step down on January 14th. Now, who saw that coming? Who saw Tunisia coming? And then on January 25th, widespread protests began against President Mubarak's regime in Egypt. These took the form of an intensive campaign of civil resistance supported by large numbers of people, mainly consisting of continuous mass demonstrations. By January 29th, it became clear that Mubarak's regime had lost control. The army took a semi-neutral stance on the events, and on February 11th, Mubarak resigned, fled Cairo, and the vice president and the Egyptian military assumed control, promising changes. So then anti-government demonstrations had spread throughout the region, Bahrain, Syria, and now Libya, which has led to what now appears to be a civil war in Libya with military intervention by our country, by the United States in concert with NATO and some Arab countries, and what no one wants to call a war, but for which the term no-fly zone seems inadequate. And as if these unexpected, unprecedented political events in the Arab world were not enough to knock us off balance, on February 24th, a 6.3 magnitude earthquake hit Christchurch, New Zealand, killing 182 people, leaving $12 billion in damage. Now, I visited Christchurch, so for me this was particularly difficult to watch. It's a wonderful little town. And just as we had begun to assimilate that tragedy, the 5th largest earthquake in recorded history hit northern Japan, quickly followed by a tsunami, which, though more limited in range than the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, visited a level of destruction that overwhelmed the careful, widespread tsunami planning of the Japanese government, which triggered, as we all are too aware, a nuclear disaster, which has shaken the whole world and which is still unfolding, which we don't know the results of yet. Meanwhile, back here at the ranch in Wisconsin, efforts by the new government and the newly minted conservative legislature to overturn 80 years of hard-won union rights and enact legislation that demonizes workers led to the longest sustained political demonstrations in this country that this country has seen for a very, very long time. Crowds of 100,000 demonstrators descended on Madison again and again, centered on the state capital. Madison is another town that I visited, and let me tell you, it's not Washington, D.C. 100,000 people would carpet this town from one end to the other. So, protesting, engaging in the struggle for the rights of workers that's galvanized the attention of the nation. If this were the only thing that had happened between now and the first of the year, it would be an astonishing event in our lives. And at the same time, our national attention has been riveted on Washington, where a newly elected Congress is beset by ideological forces intent on shutting down NPR and family planning, the EPA, college grants, seemingly every program that they can find which assists the poor or the needy, or the public interest. All of which has created the specter of a shutdown of the United States government by the end of the week. I'm not sure that I've even listed everything here. There may be more that's on people's minds. Maybe it's just me, but it really does seem as if we've had more than a year's worth of turmoil and tragedy, danger and drama, and we're only a third of the way through the year. It makes my head spin. Why do I bring this up? Well, there's two reasons. First, I think it's important to acknowledge the context in which we're living and the impact of those events on our lives. I was aghast at the shootings in Arizona, frustrated at our inability to keep guns out of the hands of the deranged. I've been both fearful and exhilarated by the events in the Middle East. I've been angry at what I see as an assault on the middle-class Americans and poor Americans that's been taking place in our state capitals, in Washington and Indiana and Ohio and Texas and Maine. And I have shared the common anguish at the death and the destruction first in New Zealand and then in northern Japan. And I've been furious, yet again, what I see as the duplicity of the nuclear industry and the collusion of governments in that duplicity. So while I don't presume that my feelings speak for all of us, we all experience the impact of these events. It's important for us to acknowledge with one another that, yes, the world seems particularly topsy-turvy these days. And my second reason, well, I had decided to talk today about that particular ethical culture phrase, deed before creed, which hangs above my head here this morning, and which hangs above the head of every speaker who steps to this podium, and which hangs above the head of speakers in every ethical culture, ethical humanist society, either literally or historically. And I think that reflecting on the abstractions of any religious or philosophical notion always needs to be connected to the reality of a chaotic world. If this phrase, or for that matter, if this phrase is going to be of any use to us, it must be useful in bad times as well as in good times. Deed before creed. It's a phrase bequeathed to us by Felix Adler. And today I want to explore the ways that either informs us now or doesn't. And for visitors today, Felix Adler founded the first ethical society in New York City in 1876. And this society, founded in 1950, traces its history to his work, which became known as the ethical culture movement. Now, I'm just beginning to mine Adler's history and thinking, and for many of you here who have been a part of this community for many years, this may be a familiar territory. Still, I think it's important. It's important material for me and for us. Not because I think Adler got everything right, but because I think there's no way to understand the ground that we stand on here in Garden City in 2011, or what direction we may be moving in, without a better understanding of the circumstances and the people that set the ethical culture movement in motion. Now, in 1873, when Felix Adler had just returned from studying theology in Germany, which was then the hotbed of radical religious ferment. Now, I know this sounds funny to me, but it was the hotbed of radical religious thought, Germany in 1873. He gave a sermon at his father's synagogue. His father was a rabbi. And Adler spoke of religion needing to be out in the world, out in the marketplace. He said, a religion such as Judaism ever claimed to be, not of the creed, but of the deed. Now, this is one of the stories that is most endearing to me about Adler. This opportunity to come home, and this may be because, as many of you know, my parents were both ministers. So this idea of Adler returning from Germany and preaching a sermon which, as it happened, ended any possibility of him becoming the rabbi in his father's synagogue is just a sweet story for me. But here's the first time we see this, or at least I see this: a religion such as Judaism ever claimed to be, not of the creed, but of the deed. So many have heard the story before, but the sermon was way too radical. The expectation that he would succeed his father as rabbi was dropped. And then he spent 3 years at Cornell University teaching religion and philosophy. Now, some of those who heard his sermon liked what they heard, and they arranged for him to speak again in New York. And on May 15th, 1876, he spoke at Standard Hall. Now, this address is generally seen as the founding event of ethical culture. And in that speech, Adler said, diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed. This is the common ground where we may all grasp hands, united in mankind's common cause. Now, this time, Adler lit up the New York religious scene like a flare. He was a breath of fresh air, and he was the man in a particular moment. The country was ready for some new thought. Now, the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species 9 years earlier just 9 years earlier, this book had just hit people's consciousness. It galvanized religious thinkers across the spectrum. Liberal thinkers, recognizing that Darwin provided a new foundation to stand on, and conservative thinkers correctly perceiving that the ground had just been pulled out from under them. And add to that the New York of 1876, a major city in a country just 10 years past the devastation of the Civil War. Now, as I thought about this, I've become more and more aware over the years of what a catastrophe that war was to this country, how it left this country on its knees. And then I thought, as I wrote this too, I thought about many of you here lived through the Second World War, of course, and then into the 50s. Many of you lived into the 50s. That same burst of energy and creativity, excitement at being able to get back to life and get things going, that same energy was suffused throughout the culture of the United States in the 1870s. They got the war behind them, and they were ready to go about the business of living. They were primed, ready, bursting at the seams with growth and innovation, transforming culture and commerce in every direction. Deeds, not creeds, Adler said at this time. Deeds, not creeds. And people from around the country and around the world came to hear him speak and went home to found ethical societies. By 1879, Adler and his group had established the visiting nurse service, the first public health initiative, as well as starting a kindergarten. Within 10 years, they had started the Fieldstone schools, which originally provided education to those disadvantaged by poverty. And in the decade that followed, if you look at any reform movement of any importance, public education, health care, child labor laws, the rights of labor, unions, civil rights, the rights of women, legal aid, the Civil Liberties Union, the NAACP, you'll see the names of Adler or the name of Adler or the names of many who heard Adler's lectures or who were members of the ethical culture societies. Deeds, not creeds. Deed, not creeds. And then after years of social reform, an interesting thing happened. In 1894, Adler returned from a sabbatical year, a trip to Europe. And when he returned, he let go of the phrase, deeds, not creeds. And he began to use the formulation, deed before creed. Now, this is just the substitution of one word, but it is a sharp turn. After nearly 20 years of breakneck submersion in the social reforms of the era, Adler takes a breath and realizes that a life of action has to be grounded in a life of reflection and thought in a way that it would seem he did not appreciate before. So from this point on, his writing, his speaking are much more influenced by his own introspection and his own spiritual reflection. And to my understanding, that would continue to the end of his life. Adler starts the second chapter of his book, The Religion of Duty, by positing a movement in which members are, in matters of religious opinion, entirely free to differ, while at the same time they share a belief that truth is progressive and may be increased in the world. Entirely free to differ, and yet sharing a belief that truth is progressive and may be increased in the world. And then in the next paragraph, he states that people should have, this is interesting, people should have a definite concept of the meaning of the word God. And if they do not, he says, they do not have a robust mind, which I think for Adler was a heavy criticism. Adler says, I deem it highly important that one should speak of religious subjects and submit his thoughts to others, to be accepted or rejected in whole or in part as they may seem wise. What that says to me is that Adler rejects any orthodoxy, but he still thinks that people should engage in the practice of theology and reflection. He rejects orthodoxy, but still thinks people should be engaged in reflection. And now, any review of our material here at the Ethical Society of Long Island, Ethical Humanist Society, review our material, and the thought of Adler makes clear how he has helped to shape who we are and who we, at our best, would like to be. Does anybody do you have one of the brochures that you don't have to hold it up. I'm just making a point. This is the first thing that we give to somebody who has come to visit, is our brochure. This is what we think that we are, what we want to... You don't have to fight it. I just wanted to make the point that this is the first contact, be somebody who shows up to say, so who are these people? What's going on here? It's this brochure. And in that brochure, you'll find a line of thought from Felix Adler. So our brochure, which we quickly share with visitors, contains vocabulary and sentiments first laid out by Felix Adler. We say in that brochure emphatically that we are non-theist, that we take no position on God for or against. Not atheistic, we say, but non-theistic. And in this declaration, we can trace Adler's influence. But I think that sometimes we overlook an important part of Adler's formulation, the successive iterations of his philosophy, from a religion such as Judaism ever claimed to be, not of the creed but of the deed, at his father's temple in 1873, to diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed. This is the common ground where we still may all grasp hands, united in mankind's cause, spoken at Standard Hall 3 years later. Then deeds, not creeds, during the 1880s, and then deed before creed, proclaimed at the beginning of the 20th century. They lay out a fundamental aspect of Adler's teaching. Deeds first, but creed as well. Both are necessary in the ethical and moral life that he imagined and that he worked for. Of course, Adler's teachings are not the only forces that shaped ethical culture and ethical humanism. Now, our society, as many of you well know, our society is also firmly grounded in the 20th century humanism and in scientific materialism. In 1933, the year before Adler died, the first Humanist Manifesto appeared, signed by John Dewey and a host of prominent Unitarian ministers and ethical culture leaders. The manifesto spoke of the unfolding of a religious humanism that would marry modern thought with the ancient human impulse to religion. They said, "We are convinced that the time has passed for theism, deism, modernism, and the several varieties of new thought." The time has passed. So in the subsequent decades of the 20th century, I'd venture to say that the ethical movement was profoundly shaped by the sentiments of the first Humanist Manifesto and by the scientific materialism to which the manifesto points. Simply put, scientific materialism holds that the world is made up of matter. All that exists is substance. So, everything, including consciousness, including dreams, are made of substance, made of material. Everything, dreams, is matter. Furthermore, if we can't know it, it doesn't exist. If we can't know God, then God cannot exist. That's scientific materialism in a nutshell. Now this, you may observe, this is a far step beyond non-theism. We may say that we take no position on the existence of God, which implies a commitment to religious tolerance, but I think that the strong tradition of scientific materialism in the ethical culture movement is pretty powerful. And we may not always embody the toleration that we espouse. I bring this up because I think it's a serious consideration for us. For the record, I'm a scientific materialist. But I also come out of a tradition which values free inquiry and religious tolerance. Now, our brochure here says that under the heading of 12 core values of ethical humanism, that I am free to question and I am free to choose what I believe. That's what we say. And I think it's actually sometimes a bit of a challenge for us. But if we're going to say it, I think we ought to try to live it. Deed before creed. It's a shorthand here that's particularly useful to us. Our ethics, our religion is ethics, that's what we say. And what we mean by that, as near as I can figure, is that we believe that what we do, our deeds, and the way we live with one another, again, our deeds, is more to the point than what we believe, which is our creed. But at the same time, what we believe is an integral part of our ability to act. Adler understood this. And in his later decades, he became more and more committed to the idea that our ability to act in the world is shaped and sustained by the development of our character. Adler's friend William James put it, philosophy is the expression of a man's intimate character. A philosophy is an expression of a man's inner character, intimate character. And Adler says to be a cheerful work builder, to take an active and wholehearted interest in the improvement of material conditions, in political reforms and the embellishments of earthly life, one must at the same time keep the spiritual end in view as the supreme end. Now, Adler says this is a quote from later in his life, and Adler says this in the light of the failures and the shortfalls of so much of the reform that he undertook over the years. And here, I hope, is where we can circle back to the list of tragedies and trauma, setbacks, with which I began this address. For Adler, as a reformer, encountered every sort of difficulty and obstacle. The rampant inequality in the years that he was alive. There was racial hatreds, educational inadequacies, economic disparities, the abuse of power. He lived through the robber baron age. There were railroad robber barons, unregulated business, a world war. Adler's experience as a reformer resulted, in his own words, in partial success and frustration. Adler found in his days what we find in ours, that our best efforts to improve the world too often meet with partial success and frustration. And our best hopes for the world are often overshadowed by natural disasters, war, the drastic swings of political fortune. Who would have imagined the series of events that have churned the world in the last 3 months? Actions, deeds, are the outcome of a life that is centered in ethics. But so are creeds. Not in the sense of some description of God that we are challenged to believe in or not to believe in, but creed as a shorthand for the ongoing attention to what we hold most dear, what we come to understand about the world and our place in it, and what we find to sustain us in our efforts to live a life of meaning. And this is what we do here. This is what we do here. This is what community is for, as far as I'm concerned. We come together because It's easier to make a difference in the world when we combine our talents, our resources. But we also gather because we need one another. If we're going to come to know who we are and what we are made of, it is in the cauldron of community, the cauldron of community, that we will come to know who we are and will be challenged to shape a creed, challenged to make sense for ourselves, find what it is that we truly believe. And Adler put it this way, and I'll leave you with this quote that's familiar to many of you, I'm sure. He said that my neighbor has need of me. There is something as yet hidden in him, which I must help to make manifest. And also, I have need of my neighbor. There is something in me for the revelation of which I depend on him. So, thank you. I think it is time for our music again. Larry Mosier and Mary Nagin.